Imagine closing your eyes for a moment, and before you know it, you are standing again at the gate of your old school in the 1960s. Not a polished memory shaped by nostalgia, but the real place with its chipped paint, its high windows, the way the morning light fell through dust motes like a hush. Feel that small tightness in your chest, that strange, tender ache of recognition. Certain places live inside us long after their bricks are gone, and this one keeps calling us back as if time itself had bookmarked it. I remember the smell first, the chalk dust that clung to the air before anyone spoke, before laughter, before lessons began. It was a simple scent, but now it feels almost holy, as if the room was consecrated to learning and small human rituals. There were no glowing screens to steal our attention. There were voices, the scratch of pencils, the quiet miracle of turning a page. Mornings seemed longer then, as if the day stretched out and let us wander in it. The future felt like open countryside, endless and kind. The school was small, though memory grows buildings larger. Later, when I returned years on, everything looked diminished, but in my mind each corridor remained vast, each classroom an ocean. Light would slice through the thick curtains in bands, warming the worn wooden desks that bore generations of carvings and initials. I remember tracing some of those initials with my finger, imagining the hands that had made them, the small rebellions and secret promises etched into the wood. Even as a child I felt, dimly, that we were part of a long line, that these scratches were tiny monuments. Sound shaped that place, the creak of the old floorboards, footsteps echoing down hallways, the distant rattle of the radiator in winter. Even the silence had texture, a patient, sacred silence that taught us how to listen. We learned the value of quiet. Perhaps that's where some of our early wisdom was born, in the ability to sit still and let the world come into us without demanding anything. My teacher's face is fogged now, like a photograph worn at the edges, but her voice remains precise in my memory, calm, deliberate, full of the kind of patient authority that felt like shelter. She spoke slowly, as if each sentence were a small gift. Sitting there with cold hands on a yellowing notebook, I felt safe in a way that is hard to name now. As if the world outside the classroom couldn't touch us while that voice defined our mornings. We remember sensations more than facts, the safety of being tended, the intimate certainty that someone else held the map while we learned the terrain of life. My classmates passed through my mind in fragments, the crooked smile of the boy who always traded sandwiches, the girl who folded paper cranes in the margin, the loud laugh that filled a corridor. Many of them are gone, some I meet with white hair and a slow grin, 1,000 small years in their posture, but in those days their faces were open like windows. Their eyes held a light that belonged only to children who believe the tomorrow ahead is infinite. We thought it was recess was an island of exuberance. The clang of the bell, slightly off pitch, metallic and urgent, would sweep the classroom into motion, and for a little while the world became a cascade of voices and scuffed shoes. Each game, each scraped knee, each whispered confidence felt enormous then, because our sense of proportion was generous and patient. Time was a companion, not an enemy. There were rituals everywhere, the lined-up shoes at the classroom door, morning pledges, mumbled with sleepy voices, the slow march to assemblies where someone read out names like prayers. Little objects carried meaning, a ruler with a nick, a lunch tin dented from years of use, a sweater threaded with repairs. To us they were not mere things but anchors, proof of presence, of survival, of the small economies of care that stitched a childhood together. Sometimes, when I sit quietly now, I can almost feel the weight of that school bag on my shoulders, the way it strapped bit into the flesh, as if marking us for the day. I can recall the sting of cold hands in winter and the sweet stickiness of orange soda on hot afternoons. Memory lines itself with sensory threads, scent, sound, touch, and pull them tight, and suddenly I am there again, not as an observer but as the child who believed in the slow arc of things. Perhaps that is why these recollections hurt and heal at once. They remind us of a version of life where meaning accrued in small, deliberate ways. Places that have vanished from maps remain vivid inside us because they are repositories of feeling, the kind of feeling that resists the noise of later years. They teach us that some truths are not learned from headlines but from the quiet architecture of our days. How light fell on a desk. Listen now. Walk with me down that corridor slowly, without haste. Breathe the chalk and dust and sunlight. Reach out and touch the rough edge of a desk. You will find, as I did, that a door opens not to a classroom but to the earliest rooms of your own life, and when it closes behind you there will be a small consoling warmth that feels like home. When I think back on those early mornings, walking toward the school building with the sun barely stretching over the rooftops. I remember how the world felt quieter then. Not just the streets, though they were gentler too, but the world inside me. I carried fewer thoughts, fewer worries, fewer names for the emotions that fluttered through my chest. Everything felt softer, as if wrapped in a thin layer of innocence that shielded me from the sharp edges of reality. I can still hear the sound my shoes made on the sidewalk, a steady rhythm that echoed my small heartbeat, and with every step, the school came into view like a familiar destination in a dream, both comforting and mysterious. There was a moment, just before entering the building, when I would pause. I didn't know why at the time. Children rarely understand their own rituals, but I always lingered for a breath or two. Maybe it was the cool morning air brushing against my cheeks, or the faint scent of someone's distant fireplace burning softly in the neighborhood, or perhaps it was the anticipation of crossing a threshold, the feeling that once I stepped through those doors, time would stretch and bend, and the day would unfold with its own quiet magic. Today, I think that those pauses were my way of savoring the stillness, sensing in my bones that childhood moves faster than we ever expect. Inside, the hallways carried a different kind of silence, not empty, but waiting. A silence filled with the presence of children who had not yet arrived, with the ghosts of yesterday's laughter still floating in the air. The floor, polished to a shine, reflected faint shapes of window panes, and when the sun finally reached the right angle, beams of golden light spilled across the hall like pieces of warm fabric. I remember touching that light with my fingertips, marveling at how something so intangible could feel so real. When you're young, the world offers these small wonders for free. You only realize their value decades later, when the world feels heavier and less inclined to unfold its magic. My classroom door was always slightly ajar. I would push it open slowly, as if entering a sacred space. And in a way, it was. The smell of old wood, chalk, and paper greeted me like an old friend. The desks, though simple, seemed to carry their own personalities. Some wobbling slightly, others carved with initials, a few with old paint stains that no one bothered to remove. I often wondered how many lives those desks had touched, how many whispered secrets, silent fears, and quiet hopes had rested upon them. Even now, when I picture those desks, I feel a pang in my chest, as if remembering the weight of time itself. There was a particular seat I favored, near the window but not too close, where I could steal glances at the outside world without being caught lost in daydreams. From there, I watched leaves flutter in the wind, birds trace invisible patterns across the sky, and clouds drift lazily as if they, too, had nowhere urgent to be. Sometimes, when the teacher spoke, her words faded into the background and those scenes outside the window became a silent lesson of their own. I learned to observe, to wonder, to imagine. Perhaps the seeds of who I became were planted in those quiet glances, tucked between the lines of a child's wandering mind. In the early hours, before the noise of the day began, I would sometimes place both hands on the wooden surface of my desk and close my eyes. The wood felt cool, solid, grounding, like an anchor, and I could hear subtle sounds that most people never notice. The ticking of the old clock above the chalkboard, the distant hum of the boiler, the gentle rustle of papers caught in a draft. These sounds were not interruptions, they were part of the room's heartbeat. They reassured me that the world was steady, that time moved in a patient rhythm, that life unfolded one moment at a time. Gradually, the room filled with life, soft footsteps, shy greetings, the soft scraping of chairs pulled into place. We weren't loud in the early morning. It was as if we all respected those first moments of the day, acknowledging their fragility. There was something sacred about that transition from silence to gentle sound, as though we were waking the room up with our presence. To this day, I sometimes long for that kind of transition, slow, respectful, almost ceremonial, instead of the hurried jolts that mark adult mornings. And then, as always, came a moment that stitched us together, the turning of the teacher's key in the lock as she arrived. That small metallic click might seem insignificant now, but back then it carried the weight of an entire world opening. We would straighten our backs subtly, not out of fear but out of a shared understanding that something important was beginning. Her footsteps were calm, measured, almost melodic, and as she stepped into the room, the atmosphere changed, not abruptly but like a gentle tide rising to meet the shore. She would smile, not a wide smile, but a warm one that seemed to gather all of us into a single embrace. And in that moment, I felt something I didn't have words for at the time: belonging. Pure, simple belonging. The kind that only childhood, and places like that, can offer. There was something profoundly comforting about the way our mornings officially began, not with noise or commands, but with a quiet ritual that felt almost sacred. The teacher would place her worn leather bag on the desk, smoothing its surface with a careful hand, as if acknowledging the years it had carried her burdens. Then she would open the window just a little, letting in a soft breath of morning air mixed with the scent of fresh grass or distant rain. It was such a small gesture, but for us, it was the signal that the day had truly arrived. Even now, I can feel the faint, cool breeze brushing the side of my face, carrying the promise of another day that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. We would take out our notebooks, the covers faded, the pages slightly rough against our fingertips, and the simple act of turning to a fresh page felt like opening the door to possibility. I remember the drag of the pencil across the paper, that familiar texture that no modern pen or keyboard can replicate. Each line we wrote seemed to anchor us to the moment, to the slow rhythm of learning that shaped our world. There was no rush, no pressure to outperform, no need to be anything other than present. Learning back then wasn't a race, it was a quiet unfolding, like a flower opening one petal at a time. The chalkboard dominated the front of the room, a towering presence that seemed almost alive. I loved watching the teacher pick up a stick of chalk, the tip already worn from previous lessons. She would tap it lightly before writing, releasing a tiny puff of white dust that floated in the sunlight like snow. And when she wrote, her hands steady, her movements deliberate, the soft squeak of the chalk became a sound I associated with safety. A strange thing perhaps, but it felt like a tether, an anchor to the world I trusted. Sometimes I would watch her hand instead of the words themselves, mesmerized by the way the chalk left temporary scars on the green surface, before being wiped away, as if reminding us that even the most important lessons were fleeting. But what I remember most vividly were the moments just before a lesson began. The room would settle into a hush, not silence, but a shared breath, a collective stillness. You could hear the faint shifting of clothes, the quieting of whispers, the almost imperceptible cracking of old wooden desks as they adjusted to our restlessness. In those seconds, everything felt suspended, as if the world outside the room had paused to let us be children a little longer. Sometimes I wonder if that feeling, that fragile bubble of pure presence, is what we spend our adult lives trying to return to. When the lesson finally started, her voice would fill the room with a warmth that felt almost physical. It wasn't just instruction, it was storytelling. Even when she taught arithmetic or grammar, there was rhythm in her words, a cadence that invited us in. She had a way of making the ordinary feel important, as if every sentence contained a secret meant only for us, and we listened, truly listened. Not because we were forced to, but because something in her tone made us believe that learning was a journey, not a task. Occasionally, she would stop mid-sentence and look out the window for a moment, her expression softening as if she were remembering something from her own childhood. At the time, I thought she was simply pausing to think, but now, after all these years, I suspect she was traveling through her own memories, perhaps longing for the same innocence we didn't yet realize we possessed. There was something universal in that pause, a shared understanding that we are all shaped by the classrooms that held us, by the people who gave us their time, their attention, their patience. Sometimes, the sun would shift, casting warm rectangles of light across the floor, and dust particles would shimmer like tiny, drifting constellations. I would watch them rise and fall, imagining they were tiny universes carrying children's dreams. It sounds poetic now, but back then it was simply what my mind did, wandering, drifting, creating stories out of small, ordinary things. That classroom, with all its imperfections and routines, felt like a safe harbor for imagination. And then of course there were the moments when the whole class erupted into quiet giggles. When someone made a funny face from behind a book, or when a pencil rolled off a desk at the worst possible time, causing a chain of stifled laughter. Even the teacher would sometimes smile, pretending she hadn't noticed. Those moments were tiny, but they stitched us together in ways we never understood at the time. Looking back, I realize that childhood is made of these small seams, the laughter shared, the secrets whispered, the fleeting bonds that leave permanent marks. Near mid-morning, the scent of polished floors would mix with the faint aroma of lunches packed in tin boxes. Peanut butter, apples, homemade bread, simple foods whose smell could fill the room with comfort. It was a reminder that life back then was built from small, tangible things, things you could touch and taste and hold. Life wasn't abstract yet. It had texture, and somewhere deep inside me, in those long seconds between the sound of chalk and the soft shuffle of feet, I learned what presence meant. Not mindfulness as we talk about today, but a natural, unself-conscious existence. Just being, just breathing, just living within the moment without trying to capture it. Those mornings taught me that before the world becomes complicated, before responsibility wraps its heavy hands around our shoulders, there are places where time is gentle, and if we listen closely enough, we can still hear their echo. By mid-morning, the classroom had warmed, not just from the sun slowly climbing its way across the windows, but from the gentle buzz of our young minds waking up. There was a softness to those hours that I rarely felt since the kind of suspended time where the world seemed to unfold at a slower pace, as if it knew we were still learning how to carry it. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can feel that warmth settle on my skin, like a memory trying to reclaim me. Around that time, the teacher would ask us to take out our reading books, thick cloth-bound things with frayed corners and the scent of countless hands turning their pages. They weren't glossy or perfect. They were lived in, softened by years of use. I remember how the rough texture of those covers felt against my palms, and how each page carried a faint, dusty smell that made me feel strangely grounded. There was something honest about those books, something simple and sturdy, like knowledge passed down through generations rather than streamed through wires. When we read aloud, our voices became a tapestry, uneven, timid, sometimes cracking, but full of innocence. Each child brought their own rhythm, their own tiny courage, and together it formed a sound that still echoes in me. I can still hear the boy who read too quickly, stumbling over words as if racing against himself, and the girl who whispered each syllable with delicate care like she feared she might shatter the story if she spoke too loudly. And there was me, somewhere in between, reading steadily, listening as much to the breath between sentences as to the words themselves. Those readings taught me something subtle, something I didn't understand then, that every voice, no matter how small, carries its own music. Sometimes the teacher would pause our reading and tell a story from her own childhood, and in those moments the room changed. The air grew still, as if holding its breath. Her stories were simple, about chores on the farm or walking miles to school through snow or the first time. She understood loss, but to us they felt enormous, like windows into a world we hadn't known existed. Her voice carried a quiet authority, not the kind that demands obedience, but the kind that invites you to listen because it feels like truth being handed over gently. I think those moments planted in me an understanding that stories are more than entertainment. They are vessels of memory, tiny lifeboats carrying pieces of who we are. The classroom itself seemed to listen with us. The walls, covered with faded posters and carefully drawn charts, felt protective, almost maternal. You could see pencil marks from students long gone, faint reminders that life had moved through these rooms again and again. Even the light had a memory, the way it filtered through the dusty blinds, casting long, soft shadows that shifted like the turning of a page. It made everything feel intimate, held, cherished. Sometimes I wonder if that room was the first place I learned what nostalgia was, long before I ever knew the word. And yet, beneath all that calm, there was a small, steady hum of excitement. Maybe it was the anticipation of recess, or the simple thrill of imagination stretching its wings. Maybe it was just the natural rhythm of being a child. We would tap our feet lightly, or drum our fingers on the desks, or exchange brief glances that held whole conversations. It was in those tiny gestures that friendships formed quietly, without ceremony. I remember one friend in particular, a boy who sat at desks to my left. He always had a pencil behind his ear and a habit of doodling tiny spaceships in the margins of his assignments. He would catch my eye and give me a quick, conspiratorial grin, as if we shared some secret understanding. We rarely talked deeply. Children don't need many words to feel connected. But there was comfort in his presence, in knowing that someone's laughter was always ready to meet mine. Years later, when I heard he had moved far away, I felt a peculiar ache, the kind you feel when a piece of your childhood quietly drifts out to sea. Around that same time each morning, the classroom would fill with the faint scent of sharpened pencils, a mix of wood shavings and graphite that, to this day, brings me back instantly to those mornings. There was something ritualistic about sharpening a pencil, about watching the thin curls of wood fall like soft petals onto the floor. It felt like preparation, like readiness, a small, almost ceremonial act that told the world, I am here, I'm learning, I'm part of something. Sometimes, when the teacher wasn't looking, I would glance at the clock. The second hand moved with a kind of stubborn patience, ticking its way through the morning. Back then, I thought time was slow, impossibly slow. But nostalgia has a way of twisting truths. Now I see that the slowness was a gift. It gave us time to breathe, to grow, to simply exist without rushing. If only we could understand such things when we are young. There was always a moment, a quiet one, when I would feel an inexplicable sense of peace wash over me. Maybe it happened when the room fell silent during reading, or when sunlight warmed the side of my neck, or when I realized I was surrounded by familiar faces who would share years of life with me. It was a soft, unspoken reassurance that I belonged, that I mattered, that childhood, in all its simplicity, was enough. Looking back, I realized those mornings weren't just part of my education, they were part of my becoming. The classroom wasn't just a place where we learned facts, it was where we gathered pieces of ourselves, small and fragile, that would one day shape who we became. The quiet rhythm of the 1950s had a way of smoothing even the roughest days. But every town, no matter how peaceful, had its stories. Stories whispered from porch to porch, carried by fireflies, remembered only by those who lived long enough to see life unfold like an old, yellowed photograph. And in our town, there was one story everyone remembered, even if no one talked about it directly. It was the night the sky changed colors. People today wouldn't believe it. They'd say it was an electrical malfunction, or a weather anomaly, or simply the exaggerated memory of aging hearts. But those who lived it never forgot the feeling. The way everything suddenly froze, as if time itself took a breath. It happened in the early summer of 1956. Kids had just finished school, mothers were canning fruit in their kitchens, and fathers were polishing their cars for weekend drives. Life was stitched together with small rituals and familiar sounds. And then, one evening, the sky over the town glowed strange, shimmering, almost metallic. It wasn't frightening at first, just different, like the world had flipped a page without warning. In the Johnson household, little Annie was the first to notice. She stood barefoot in the backyard, clutching a skipping rope, staring upward as if listening to something no one else could hear. Her grandmother, rocking on the porch, whispered, "I've seen this once before, long, long ago." But, when pressed, she shook her head, eyes suddenly wet, and muttered, "Some things are better left to memory." On Maple Street, radios crackled with static, dogs whined, babies who were sound asleep seconds earlier began to cry all at once, and the older folks, those who grew up before electricity lit the town, froze with an expression that blended fear and awe. They recognized something the younger ones could not, because in the 1950s, people trusted their senses, they trusted silence, they trusted the natural rhythm of life, and that night everything felt out of rhythm. No one knew exactly when it happened, but the air grew warmer, as if an invisible hearth had been lit above the clouds. The leaves on the trees trembled even though there was no wind. Streetlights flickered. A far-off hum vibrated beneath the ground, so faint that you could almost convince yourself it wasn't there. And then, just as quickly as it began, every clock in town stopped. Some said it lasted 1 minute. Others swore it lasted an hour. But everyone remembered the sound that came next. A soft ringing like a distant church bell, echoing through the sky. Old Mr. Harrington, the town's retired watchmaker, claimed he felt the ground pulse beneath his shoes, like the heartbeat of something enormous. His wife insisted she saw sparks in the air, drifting like ash from a fire that no one could see. But here's the part no one ever forgot. During that silent, suspended moment, people felt peaceful, as if life itself pressed pause not to frighten them, but to remind them of something they had been too busy to notice, something gentle, almost divine. Some believed it was a sign, an omen of protection. Others whispered that it marked the exact moment when the world began to change, when innocence started to slip away, even though no one knew it yet. And when the clocks finally ticked forward again, life resumed as if nothing had happened. Radios came back. Dogs stopped whining. The sky returned to its soft summer blue. Families went back inside as though waking from a dream they chose not to speak about. Still, in the days that followed, people were kinder. They lingered longer on their porches. They spoke more softly to their children. They held each other a little tighter, unsure why, but absolutely certain that something sacred had brushed against their lives. Even now, decades later, if you ask the oldest residents what really happened that night, they'll smile the same bittersweet smile and say, life was different after that. Not worse, not better, just different. Like the world blinked, and when it opened its eyes again, something had shifted in all of us. And maybe that's what the 1950s were truly made of, not just routines and rituals, but moments that felt almost magical. Moments that stitched themselves into the fabric of memory, glowing softly long after the world moved on.
In those days, letters were more than paper and ink, they were lifelines. Entire stories, hopes, confessions, and pieces of the heart were folded neatly into envelopes and carried across the country by hands that never knew their meaning. And every household had at least one letter they remembered forever. Ours arrived on a rainy afternoon in November 1957, nearly a year after it had been written. Everyone knew him as the boy who fixed bicycles, helped elderly neighbors carry groceries, and spent long afternoons sketching by the lake. He had a gentle spirit, the kind people felt safe around. He had been drafted and sent far from home, a place he loved, a place he believed he would return to unchanged. Before he left, he promised his childhood sweetheart, Lily Carson, that he would write every week. She carried his first letters in her purse wherever she went, reading and rereading them until the creases became soft as cloth. People tried to comfort her, but in the 1950s, comfort often came in silence: a warm hand on the shoulder, a cup of tea left on the porch, a prayer whispered when no one was listening. A transport convoy, miscommunication, losses. The postman, an old friend of the family, approached Lily's house with an expression she would never forget, half sorrow, half relief, as though the letter in his hand carried both an ending and a beginning. The ink on the front had faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas Whitmore. He spoke of missing home, missing the sound of her laughter, missing the smell of her mother's apple pie cooling by the window. If this letter reaches you late, I want you to know something. I carry you with me in every step, every breath, every borrowed moment. And if life chooses a different path for me, don't wait. Live, love, find joy wherever it hides, not in grief, though grief was there, but in gratitude. The rain outside softened to a drizzle, and for a moment, the world felt still, as though honoring Thomas's final gift. Mrs. Turner reconciled with her estranged sister after 20 years. Mr. Grady, the town's stoic barber, allowed himself to cry openly for the first time anyone could remember. Even children, who didn't fully understand the weight of the story, sensed the shift. They played quieter, they hugged their parents longer. They listened to the adults with eyes wide, as though learning something sacred about what it meant to be human. She never married, though she lived a full and radiant life, teaching, painting, laughing freely. She would often say that Thomas had given her two gifts, his love and his blessing to keep living even when he no longer could. Not spoken loudly, not embellished, simply remembered. A reminder that the 1950s were not only defined by routines and rituals, but also by moments of breathtaking tenderness, moments in which the world paused, if only for a heartbeat, to reveal the fragile beauty woven into every ordinary day. There was something profoundly tender about growing up in a world that still felt small. Not limited, just small enough that every face meant something, every street carried a memory, and every summer seemed to last a lifetime. The 1950s had a rhythm that wrapped itself around you, a rhythm born not of speed, but of presence. And perhaps that is why the memories from that decade linger like perfume on old letters, because life unfolded slowly enough to be felt. It didn't demand. It offered itself gently, like an open hand waiting to be held. Front porches were open invitations, kitchens had no locked doors, and everyone knew the sound of every car engine on every block. Girls dreamed of singing on a local radio station or helping their mothers bake pies for the church fair. Boys sat in their rooms imagining what it would be like to fly an airplane or work at the town pharmacy. Dreams were small, but they were held close to the heart, tender, personal, attainable. And the adults, their dreams were even simpler. A steady job, a warm home, a family gathered around the supper table. A Sunday morning when nothing hurt. On warm evenings, you could walk down any street and hear laughter drifting from windows, mingling with the songs of cicadas. Couples danced barefoot in their living rooms. Fathers repaired radios in the garage beneath hanging bulbs that flickered like fireflies. Mothers wrote recipes by hand, confident that someone years or decades later would find comfort in them. And the towns themselves felt alive. They breathed with the people who lived in them. If you stood near the old drugstore at dusk, you could hear the laughter of friends leaning against their cars, the soft chatter of parents strolling after supper, and the distant ringing of bicycle bells, not because the water had magic, but because dreaming aloud in the quiet of nature made your heart believe in possibilities again. Teenagers went there after school, sat on the grass, and spoke about the future with the kind of certainty only youth can hold. Some said the stars reflected in the water, like scattered promises waiting to be gathered. And maybe that's what made the 1950s so emotionally powerful. They held space for belief. Belief in goodness, in neighbors, in second chances. Belief that tomorrow would be a little kinder if you met it with patience. Belief that time, if treated gently, would treat you gently too. Older folks often say, life was slower back then, but what they really mean is, and in their trying, they created moments that still echo through the years, moments that cling to the edges of memory, sunlight on dust floating through an open window. And long after the 1950s faded into sepia tones, the dreams born in that small, gentle world continued to glow softly in the hearts of those who lived it, reminders of a time when life didn't need to be extraordinary to feel magical. I remember the way the corridors felt on rainy days, darker, softer, almost sacred. Those were the afternoons when time itself seemed to slow, as if the world outside held its breath and let us drift inside our own little universe of childhood fears, hopes, and discoveries. Even now, when I hear the faint tapping of rain against a window, something inside me stirs a memory half asleep, stretching its limbs. On those days, the school lights buzzed faintly, glowing like tired fireflies trapped behind glass. The floors glistened with the footprints of children who had run in from the storm, their shoes squeaking in a rhythm that felt strangely comforting. I can almost feel the cool air of the hallway brushing against my cheeks, carrying that earthy smell of wet pavement and chalk and dust mixing in the air. Soft voice, calm smile, hair pulled back in a simple bun, and eyes that held a deep, quiet understanding of the world. There was something almost mystical about her. Even as children, we sensed it. She wasn't like the others. She saw things, or maybe she saw us. She would gather us in the small reading room, its lamps glowing amber, books breathing their dusty perfume, and she'd tell stories that didn't quite feel like stories. They felt like memories borrowed from another lifetime. Tales about children who spoke to rivers, teachers who could smell lies, classrooms that echoed with whispers of the past. She never claimed they were true, yet she never said they weren't. Not heavy, adult steps, but light ones, quick ones, like a child running. But whenever she looked, no one was there, and yet she never felt afraid. She believed, truly believed, that some memories linger too long to fade, imprinting themselves into walls, doors, and floors. A school, she whispered, remembers the children who loved it. And I wonder, do those memories still live somewhere? Are they stitched into the bricks of the old building? Are they held tenderly by time itself, refusing to disappear? She said something once that I never forgot. We grow older, but parts of us never leave the places we loved, not as the person I am, but as both versions of myself, once the boy I was and the adult I've become, reuniting like old friends. I imagine the rain tapping softly on the windows, the lights flickering, the old wooden doors sighing open, if welcoming me home, and in that moment I'd hear it faint, distant, but unmistakable, a single pair of child's footsteps running down the hall. It just waits, quietly, patiently, like a beloved classroom holding its breath for you to walk through the door again. I remember the first time I truly noticed the way the light fell inside that old school hallway, how it stretched in long, golden strips across the worn linoleum floor, almost as if time itself were laying down its own quiet footprints. By the 9th grade, we all walked those hallways like sleepwalkers, half awkward children, half emerging adults, caught somewhere between who we were and who we would someday become. But back then, I didn't know that I'd spend the rest of my life trying to return to those hallways in my mind, trying to trace those fading strips of sunlight that once guided me through the world. The mornings always started the same, lockers slamming shut like a chorus of metallic heartbeats, the faint smell of chalk dust lingering on our sweaters, and that peculiar mixture of teenage anxiety and innocent excitement humming beneath everything. It was a time when every emotion felt amplified, when every glance could feel like a secret, and every smile carried the weight of a possibility. And yet, despite the intensity of it all, life felt simpler, as though the world outside those walls didn't quite exist yet. There was something magical about the school in the 1960s, something that doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it was the way teachers carried themselves, with a strange mixture of strictness and genuine care. Maybe it was the silence between classes, broken only by the echo of polished shoes and the faint jingle of a custodian's key ring. Or maybe it was the feeling that we were living inside a story that hadn't yet revealed its ending. There was Elaine, whose voice could silence an entire room, even though she barely ever spoke above a whisper. And Michael, who always carried a book tucked under his arm, any book. It didn't matter, as if he were afraid of being caught unprepared by life. And of course, there was Clara. I can still see her in my mind, sitting near the window in our English classroom, her hair catching the light in a way that made it glow like something holy. She had a way of looking at the world as though it were a fragile miracle, easily shattered but infinitely precious. The campus was covered in a thin, ghostly mist, the kind that softens every edge and makes the world feel like a dream have a moment fully awakened from. As I walked toward the main building, I heard music, soft, distant, almost unreal. A single violin, playing a melody I had never heard before, something slow and aching, something that wrapped itself around my ribs and made the whole world pause. And then I saw him, an older janitor I barely recognized, standing alone near the flagpole, violin resting on his shoulder, eyes closed as though he was speaking to someone only he could see. For a moment, it felt like time bent around us, like the fog was holding us inside a separate reality where nothing existed except that melody. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. It felt like witnessing something sacred, something too fragile for the ordinary world. He opened his eyes, looked directly at me, and gave the smallest nod, one that felt like a passing of some invisible torch from an older soul to a younger one. I never heard him play again, and years later, when I asked about him, no one seemed to remember his name, as if he had been nothing more than a brief whisper in the long hallway of my life. There are moments like that, soft, strange, almost magical, that stay imprinted on your memory long after everything else fades. School in the 1960s wasn't just books and teachers and report cards. It was a collection of small miracles that we were too young to understand at the time. Fleeting moments that shaped us in ways we only recognize when we're old enough to look back and finally see the invisible threads that stitched our lives together. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels far away, I still hear that violin, drifting through the fog of memory, reminding me that even the smallest moments can echo across a lifetime. I remember that the quiet moments at school in the 1960s were often the ones that stayed with me the longest. Not the noisy lunch breaks, not the frantic bell ringing, not even the proud walk home with graded papers folded in my pocket. No, it was the in-between spaces, the pauses, the slivers of silence where a child could feel the world breathing around them, where imagination became louder than any classroom chatter, where time stretched, soft and golden, like warm honey slipping across the afternoon. It was late autumn, one of those crisp, yellowed afternoons where the sunlight looked dusty, and the wind carried the faint scent of chalk dust, pencil shavings, and the hint of burning leaves from someone's yard nearby. I was sitting alone on the wooden steps behind the main building, tracing shapes in the dirt with the edge of my shoe, when something unusual caught my eye. Inside it, something glimmered faintly, like a tiny trapped star. The wind played with the ends of her ribboned hair as she tilted the jar, letting the light catch whatever was inside. For a moment, it felt like the entire world quieted to look at that jar too. So I walked closer, the wooden steps creaking softly under my weight, my breath small clouds in the cooling air. When she noticed me, she didn't step back. Instead, she lifted the jar slightly and whispered, almost reverently, "I think it's a memory." I didn't know what she meant, but the certainty in her voice made my chest tighten. Inside the jar was a firefly, blinking its soft, pulsing glow. But she spoke about it like it was something sacred, fragile, fleeting, and deeply important. "My grandfather says fireflies remember the places they used to shine," she said, her eyes fixed on the tiny creature. "He told me they carry pieces of light from summers long gone. Everything meant something. Everything had a secret. There was no rush, no screens, no notifications, no digital world demanding our attention. Just two children, sharing a moment of quiet wonder." "Do you think memories disappear?" she asked. "Or do they just hide until we're ready to see them again?" When the firefly finally dimmed, she loosened the lid. The tiny creature hesitated for a second, then drifted upward in a slow, spiraling dance, its glow fading into the evening sky until it became indistinguishable from the first appearing stars. We both watched it vanish, our breath mingling in the cool air, and I felt a strange mixture of sadness and peace. A gentle ache, the kind you only feel when witnessing something beautiful slip quietly away. It was about childhood itself, fragile, luminous, impossible to hold for long. It was about the way memories flicker and return, unexpectedly, decades later, reminding us of who we were, and who we lost along the way. And sometimes, when I least expect it, I feel that same gentle ache in my chest, the ache of remembering something I didn't even know I'd forgotten. I remember the gymnasium on cold autumn mornings, the echoing wooden floors, the dusty smell of old leather basketballs, and the way our footsteps bounced off the high rafters like distant thunder. But the memory that returns to me now isn't about sports at all. It's about something quieter, something most people forget until much later in life. The way certain places seem to hold your emotions for you, as if the walls themselves were listening. I never knew why she preferred the silence of that wide, empty room, but I could feel something in her presence, a gentleness wrapped in sadness, like morning fog that refuses to lift. She was the kind of student teachers spoke softly about, as if worried their words might crush her, and yet, when she smiled, the whole room warmed, even in winter. We were 12 in age, where silence still felt like a perfectly acceptable form of communication. We ended up talking until the rest of the students arrived, filling the gym with the chaos of bouncing balls and squeaking shoes. But before she walked away, she said something that has echoed in me for decades. "Maybe someday, we'll be able to hear each other better." Now, looking back, it feels like a fragment of wisdom spoken long before either of us understood life. But strangely, the gym never felt the same afterward. It was as if her softness had soaked into the walls, leaving behind an invisible imprint that lingered long after our footsteps faded. But the quiet souls, the gentle ones, those memories return differently. They surface in moments of stillness, reminding us that not every important presence is a loud one. Some people leave their mark in whispers, not shouts. And sometimes I wonder, did she ever find a world soft enough to hear her? Did she grow into a woman who felt understood, finally, by someone patient enough to lean into her silence? Or did life continue to drown out the delicate parts of her voice? Maybe that's why the memory of Helen remains so vivid, even now. She taught me, without ever intending to, that every one of us carries invisible stories, delicate threads of emotion that rarely get spoken aloud. And as I sit here all these years later, I can still picture that gymnasium. The empty bleachers, the soft morning light slanting across the floor, and that quiet girl tracing circles with her shoe. A moment so ordinary that it should have dissolved into the fog of forgotten days. Yet somehow, it didn't. Maybe some memories refuse to fade because they belong not to the past, but to the parts of us that never stop growing. I can still hear the echo of that afternoon, the one that somehow felt both utterly ordinary and strangely enchanted. It was late spring, the kind of day when the air drifted warm and sweet, carrying the faint perfume of chalk dust and fresh-cut grass. I remember standing beneath the wide branches of the old sycamore tree that guarded the corner of the schoolyard like a silent, wrinkled sentinel. Its bark was rough beneath my palms, peeling in long strips that reminded me of curled paper or ancient scrolls. Sometimes I simply needed a pocket of quiet to catch my breath amid the swirl of laughter, shouts, and the clattering of lockers. Yet that day, the quiet felt different, as if the world were waiting for something I couldn't name. The sun was lowering, brushing everything with that soft honey-colored glow that makes you feel as though you're living inside an old photograph. And I suppose I was, in a way, though I didn't realize it until decades later. I sat down at the base of the tree, hugging my knees, listening to the distant bounce of a basketball and the hum of a radio from someone's open window. A Motown song floated through the air, a voice smooth as velvet, singing about love that felt to grown-up for kids like us. Yet somehow we felt the ache of it anyway. Even before we had the vocabulary for heartbreak. Her dress, a pale yellow cotton one, she wore far too often, fluttered in the breeze, and her brown hair caught the sunlight in a way that made it glow like warm amber. "Can I sit?" she asked. She lowered herself beside me, not too close, but close enough that I could smell the faint scent of her soap, sunshine, and something floral I never identified. For a while, we didn't speak. We just watched the fading light dappling across the school grounds, painting shadows that stretched longer and longer with each passing minute. Then she said it, the question that even today echoes through the chambers of my memory. "Do you think people remember us when we're not around?" It wasn't the kind of question anyone our age should have been thinking about. Yet there she was, staring at the horizon, as though she could see the whole future playing out beyond it. "What do you mean?" I asked gently. "I don't know. I just wonder if teachers, or friends, or even family think about us when we're gone. Like not gone, just not here." I remember telling her, "I think so. I think the people who care about us always remember, even when we're not around. Maybe not every second, but we stay with them somehow." I didn't have the courage to ask why. Maybe I sensed that some questions, if spoken aloud, carried a weight neither of us was ready to lift. Or maybe I simply knew that silence was the kinder response, listening to the world soften into evening, sharing the kind of quiet that feels sacred, not awkward. The kind of quiet you only share with someone who has touched a part of your soul you didn't even know was waiting to be touched, just for a second, just long enough to burn itself into memory with the permanence of a constellation. Something she sensed on the edges of her life, a memory that would one day hurt, and heal, and haunt me all at once. I remember the way the world seemed to pause in those late afternoon moments, when the sun hung low and soft above the rooftops, turning everything gold. It was on days like that when the school grounds felt almost sacred, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for something unspoken to reveal itself. I would walk slowly across the empty field behind the gym, my shoes brushing through the dry grass, listening to the faint hum of cicadas, mixed with the clatter of a distant flagpole tapping in the wind. Even then, I felt that strange mix of anticipation and melancholy, like was caught between childhood and something far larger and more mysterious. When I finally stepped outside, the hallways were nearly silent, just the hollow echo of a locker door slamming far away. The campus, usually bursting with noise and motion, felt abandoned, washed in that warm orange light that belongs only to the late 1960s in my memory. I stood there, breathing in the smell of chalk dust and cut grass, when I noticed something strange by the edge of the playground. He seemed to be drawing patterns in the dirt with a broken stick, completely absorbed in whatever was unfolding in his mind. I remember walking over, quietly, as if approaching a wild animal. He didn't look up until my shadow stretched across his hands, and when he did, his eyes had that faraway look children sometimes get, the kind that suggests they can see something adults have forgotten how to imagine. I sat down slowly beside him, the ground warm beneath my legs. The map was nothing more than lines and circles, childish, abstract, almost chaotic, but as he traced them with his finger, he told me what each part meant. "This is where the wind sounds different," he murmured. "And this circle, this is the place where people say goodbye, even when they don't say it out loud." For me, it was the corner by the bike rack where my mother would wait, her face tired but soft, always smelling faintly of lavender. For someone else, it might have been the cafeteria doors, or the hallway by the trophy case, but the idea that a child could sense those invisible emotional landmarks felt profound, almost spiritual. Children of that era carried quiet worlds inside them, worlds shaped by solitude, imagination, and the strange stillness of a time with fewer distractions. But the truth was yes, I felt that way all the time. That strange ache of nostalgia for moments still unfolding, as if I already knew that the best parts of life were fragile and temporary. I could still feel the weight of his questions settling somewhere deep inside me, like a seed. I didn't know it then, but that small conversation would return to me throughout my life whenever a chapter closed, whenever someone drifted away, whenever time slipped through my fingers faster than I was ready to let it go. Even now, after all these years, I sometimes wonder what happened to that quiet boy with the dirt-drawn map. Maybe he found his place in the world. Maybe he kept living half here, half somewhere else. Or maybe, just maybe, he understood something about time and memory that the rest of us were too young or too distracted to see. But I do know this: every school has places like the ones he tried to map, places where invisible emotions linger, where children carry their unspoken dreams, fears, and goodbyes. And every adult who looks back on those years can still feel them, even if they can't quite explain why. They wait, quietly, patiently, just beneath the surface. I remember the day the hallway felt strangely longer, as if time itself had stretched its arms and asked us to slow down. It was late autumn, the kind of day when the air tasted faintly of metal and the sky looked like brushed aluminum. I was walking with my books pressed against my chest, listening to the soft squeak of my shoes on the polished floor, when I noticed something unusual. Every locker door seemed slightly ajar, just enough for the shadows inside to spill out, thin and soft like old photograph negatives. At the far end, an amber light flickered, one of those bulbs that had been dying for years but refused to surrender. And for reasons I didn't understand then, I felt pulled toward it, as if a thread had been tied around my ribs. When I reached the locker beneath the flickering light, I realized it wasn't mine, or anyone's I knew. Yet it stood open, waiting, as if expecting someone who hadn't returned in decades. But these weren't assignments or forgotten permission slips. They were letters, handwritten, delicate, folded with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. My fingers trembled as I lifted the first one, the ink faint but readable. It began with a date, October 12, 1963, and the message felt like a whisper from another life. One day, you'll remember what this place gave you. One day, you'll stand in this hallway and realize nothing ever truly disappears, least of all the parts of you that were born here. I looked around as if expecting someone to jump out and laugh, tell me it was a prank. But the hallway was empty, still, silent except for that dying bulb humming like an old beehive. It holds it for you. My breath felt heavier, as if the air had thickened around me. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hallway walls were watching me, storing something I didn't yet understand. I was gathering my books when, faint and distant, I heard it, the old bell. The one they had retired years earlier. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It was like an echo traveling through time, searching for the ears that once recognized it. No teachers paused. It was as if only I heard it, like a message meant solely for me. I remembered hearing the old bell for the last time before they disconnected it. And most haunting of all, I remembered promising myself something. Something a child would whisper to the walls, believing they were listening. I walked outside slowly, each step feeling like a thread pulling me between two eras. The wind smelled like chalk, dust and pencil shavings, impossible for a modern afternoon, yet unmistakably real. And for a moment, I swear I heard children laughing. Not the children of today, but the voices of those who once filled the playground with scraped knees, pocket marbles, and impossible dreams. As I crossed the old courtyard, I felt something settle inside my chest, a warmth that felt both new and ancient. It wasn't fear, not nostalgia, either. It was recognition, the quiet kind. The kind that makes you understand that some places don't just stay in your memory, you stay in theirs. And for the first time in years, I whispered back to the place that raised me. Back then, I only knew the soft hum of the afternoon breeze, the lazy drift of dandelion seeds over the schoolyard, and the way sunlight fell over the worn red bricks, like a blessing we were too young to notice. But now I can see it so clearly. That season felt like a pause between breaths, the last page of a chapter we hadn't realized we were writing. I could swear the hallways sounded different in those final months, less hurried, more hollow, like the building already sensed we wouldn't belong to it much longer. Every footstep echoed deeper, every whisper lingered longer. Sometimes, walking alone after the bell, I felt as though the walls were gently exhaling, releasing decades of laughter, secrets, and growing pains into the dusty spring air. New windows, new paint, new rules, but the grown-ups kept speaking about efficiency and changing voices too bright to be honest. And even though we were young, we could feel something unsettling, like a tremor under the floorboards. The door creaked in its familiar way, as if happy to see me. Dust floated in golden ribbons through beams of sunlight. It felt timeless in there, untouched by whatever modernization meant. The air smelled of paper, ink, and the faint sweetness of wood polished by years of small, curious hands. That's when I saw something I still struggle to explain. On the back wall, near the shelf of worn geography books, the wallpaper had peeled slightly, curling like an old page. Behind it, I noticed faint pencil marks, tiny, childlike hatchings. At first, I thought they were just scribbles, but when I pulled the wallpaper back a little more, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't scribbles. It was dates, names, memories etched directly into the wall, and beneath those writings, at the very bottom, almost faded to nothing, was a single sentence that sent a chill up my spine. I touched the wood gently with my fingertips, half expecting it to pulse back. It didn't, but the message remained, deep and trembling within me. But the building felt restless. I could almost hear it creaking in protest. I remember pressing my hand against that cold, freshly smooth surface and whispering, "I won't forget you." And despite everything that changed, despite the renovations and the noise and the passing of time, I carry those hidden names with me. Maybe it was gradual, like the slow fading of chalk on an old blackboard after the last bell rings. Or maybe it struck all at once, like opening a forgotten drawer and finding something that belonged to another version of yourself. But as I stand here now, in the twilight of my own life, I realize that those school memories of the 1960s were never really about classrooms or pencils or playgrounds. They were about becoming, about awakening, about discovering, in fragile pieces, who I was meant to be. Sometimes, late at night, I sit by the window and watch the neighborhood slip into its quiet rhythm. And I swear I can still hear the distant echo of the morning bell, the shuffle of saddle shoes on polished floors, the way our laughter bounced against brick walls that have long since been torn down. In those moments, the past doesn't feel far away at all. It feels like it's standing right behind me, like a familiar hand resting gently on my shoulder. Friends who vanished into adulthood, teachers who believed in us before we believed in ourselves, and even those small, fleeting moments with people whose names I can no longer recall, but whose presence left a warm fingerprint on my memory. It's strange how life works, how a brief smile from decades ago can outlast entire years of routine and responsibility. I wonder where life took her. I hope she found what she was searching for. In a way, each of us carried a room that's inside us, some hidden, some locked, some forgotten, but all of them alive with the soft glow of possibility. Growing older has taught me something the 1960s never could. That memory is not a recorder, but a painter. It adds warmth where there was cold, softness where there was fear, brightness where there was doubt. It gives us the chance to reinterpret our own lives, not as a string of events, but as a story, one with meaning, with heart, with soul. And when I look back, I don't see perfection. I see something better. I see truth. They were the beginning of everything. The beginning of learning how to love, how to fail, how to hope, how to dream. The beginning of discovering that every person we meet, every teacher, every friend, every quiet classmate sitting alone is part of the constellation that shapes who we become. Even now, I carry them with me, and maybe, in some distant way, they carry a piece of me too. But here's the truth, nostalgia isn't about wanting to go back. It's about honoring the places that formed us, the moments that softened us, the memories that taught us how to feel. Let the years fall away. Picture the schoolyard, the desks, the sunlight on those polished floors. Picture your younger self walking down a hallway you haven't visited in decades. Watch them turn a corner. Watch them smile. Watch them disappear into a life you're still living. It lives in the quiet gestures we make today, in the values we carry, in the tenderness we show. It lives in the way we still look for wonder, even after all these years.